right, okay. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presentation for tonight. I'd like to welcome Danielle Appello to speak about bird-friendly building design. Danielle is an architect and an associate principal at White & Company in the Chicago area. Welcome, Danielle, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you everybody for having me today. I'm super excited to come talk to you guys about something that's really exciting that I get to work on in my practice. So let me share my screen here. Okay. All right. So as Christina mentioned, my name is Danielle Appello. I've been practicing for about 20 years now, and probably for the last 10 to 15 is really when bird-friendly design practices started coming to the forefront. So we've been hearing about this for a while, and I would say in the last handful of years is really when it's been starting to pick up a little bit more steam within our industry. So today I want to talk a little bit high level about the architecture design process, just so that everyone has a good frame of reference for some of the terms and things I'll be talking about. And then we're going to dive into the bird-friendly best practices, what types of products are out there on the market that we use as architects. And then finally, I want to look at a case study of Willowbrook Wildlife Center, which is a wildlife rehabilitation hospital where many bird collision victims actually go to be treated. And then we're also installing a lot of bird-friendly design practices on that project. So you can kind of see in real time what those might look like. So to start with, architecture. This is really complicated. We could probably talk for hours on it, but I want to talk a little bit about the process that we go through to get these design ideas into projects. So to start with, I really want to frame it as the types of projects out there, because depending on what type of project and what type of ownership and funding sources are involved with different types of architecture, we kind of drive the solutions differently. So to start with, two main ownership and funding types of projects out there, two big categories. So the first is public projects. So think of these as your institutions, civic, government, parks and rec, education, anything that really has public money flowing through it has a different type of accountability than, say, for example, a private project type. So a private project type might be someone like a developer who's developing a project to then lease or rent it out or to potentially sell it. It could be something like a commercial office building, a large-scale multifamily housing development. It could also be a private client, such as like a healthcare entity, retail, industrial manufacturing, storage, these types of groups where they might have their own funds that they're going to go through and do a project with. And then when we talk about the different construction types in architecture, there's two general types, so commercial and residential. So commercial includes both new buildings and renovations. And so today we're going to be talking about commercial architecture, but there is a pretty large segment of architecture under residential. So that would be your single family homes, townhomes, small unit structures, etc. And I don't want to underscore that too, because residential is there's a lot of residential types of architecture out there that do impact birds. And in fact, throughout the process, a lot of times when we do community engagement, a lot of people, because their frame of reference is their home or where they live, they do want to kind of talk and engage about how residential architecture can impact birds. So that is a thing that's actually very real, but today we're going to talk about commercial architecture. And I'll try and draw some parallels and contrasts between both public and private market segments to give you a feel on how both of those work. So when we do an architecture project, it's actually a pretty long process. So I have this kind of conceptual idea of how the project works, starting from the initial idea that a project needs to happen all the way through construction. So this generally takes 2 years kind of at the low end, up to maybe 5 years at the long end. So it's a pretty long process to go through. The first couple months, 1 to 6 months, is the early design phase, is kind of how we call it. And that's when you're coming up with the ideas for whatever the building might be. Then the middle phase is about 6 to 12 months long. This is where we're actually starting to really dive into the details and all the technical parameters for every piece of that building. And then the last several years is the construction portion of the project. So when we're looking at integrating design ideas into a piece of architecture, we're really just talking about the first 1 to 6 months. So it's actually a pretty short period of time within the lifespan of any project. And this is where we have the greatest design influence. So if there are ideas out there that people are interested in integrating into a project, say bird-friendly design strategies, this is the time in the project that it really needs to come to the forefront. It needs to be valued and then worked its way into the design. If we're hitting it later in the project schedule, the odds are much less likely that it would be able to be incorporated in the design. That's just typically because all of the money has been allocated to the different portions of the project. So it's always a harder battle to say, hey, we're going to add bird-friendly design measures into this project. Hey, owner, you're going to have to take something else away. That's always just a much harder sell. So really that first beginning part is where we want to be looking at these types of strategies. And during that beginning portion of the project, really what we try to do is talk to all the different stakeholders who might have an impact on the project. This is a wheel of stakeholders from actually the project I'll be talking about later here, the case study, but it's pretty similar for most project types. Differences being this is a public project here, this wheel of stakeholders, where local residents, neighbors, all these different groups have a much greater impact on the overall design. If you have something like a developer-driven project, stakeholders might be neighbors and residents, but they might have a little bit less say within the design process. And that's just basically how the stakeholder engagement process works. And I'll describe that in a little bit. So as we start design in that first month, I would say, of the project, we get all of the stakeholders together, starting with the owner side, just to make sure that there's alignment within the ownership structure and that we're really crowdsourcing ideas from them and what they value within a project. So you can imagine that somebody whose job it is to maintain a facility might have different values from somebody who's working in a facility. They might have different values for someone who's paying for the facility. So a lot of what we're doing in the beginning part of the project is testing different ideas out with the stakeholder groups to see where everybody agrees on what the values of that project are. So this is a snapshot of one of those engagement sessions. We do a lot of interactive different activities with them. And this is usually where we float ideas that are sustainable, things like bird deterrent strategies, other sustainable ideas. Kind of running concurrently to that, there's public stakeholder engagement sessions. So for a public client, there's a lot of different things they can do. This example here on this page is for the Forest Preserve District of DuPage County, so it's a public entity. And they had a whole host of different ways to have touch points with the community to get feedback on the project. So this is a really nice, robust process. If you have, for example, a private developer, they might not do these. They might do something that's very limited based on what's required by, for example, the city of Chicago, or an alderman might suggest that they have to go through a specific process for a community meeting, but it might be less touch points than, say, for example, if you have a public entity such as a forest preserve or any other institutions. So it kind of gives you a sense of all the different ways we can reach out to the public and really crowdsource what's important to them. So actually, interestingly enough, I hear a lot about bird deterrent strategies, especially if you have something like a forest preserve project. It definitely comes up on a lot of different projects. And depending on the volume of that and how important it is to the ownership, it can make its way within the project. So that is actually a good way to have your voice heard. So as we're working with the different stakeholders, we like to say there are 4 pillars of sustainability that typically come up. So you probably immediately think of the environment when you think of sustainability, things like water, air, animals, which we'll be talking about today. But it's also a balance of economic, social, and human sustainability priorities. So these are all topics that we hear about all the time within our projects. And of course, budgets are finite. So we're really trying to balance these. So a lot of our engagement sessions really try to dig into all of these different sustainable priorities to really understand what is going to be most impactful for that project. So I'm just kind of throwing out a lot of these ideas to show you that there's just like a lot to consider in the early portions of the project. And we're really trying to guide our clients to really understand all of the things available to them to consider within a project, and then really start to dig into how to enact some of their ideas and priorities. So when it comes to bird-friendly best practices, say we go through the stakeholder engagement process, we recommend different ideas to incorporate in a project, and bird-friendly architectural design practices is something the client's interested in, or they even just are kind of interested in it and they want us to explore further and start to show them what we can do with that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of these items are. So to start with, when somebody says they want bird-friendly design practices in a building, what does that mean, and how do we as architects know what to do with that? So there's a whole host of resources out there. The first is we can look to the local authority having jurisdiction. We call it the AHJ. I'll try not to do too many abbreviations today. But the local entities like a city, a state, it could be a county might have their own standards. If you're interested, Yale has a really great database of all of these throughout the country that you can look through. They're all extremely varied, but there are commonalities to them. So first and foremost, we look to see if there's any standards out there that's required. The second is the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, which is our professional national body, actually has a framework for what they consider architectural design excellence. And in that, they state we should definitely be designing for ecosystem health within our country and the world. And under that, they actually list bird-friendly building design criteria as one of those things as architects we should be considering. And they reference the American Bird Conservancy as a resource for what those design standards should be. They don't say you have to do that. They say you should do that. Also, the U.S. Green Building Council is a third-party certification entity that can certify buildings as being very sustainable. This is a popular certification that a lot of building owners go for because it communicates to the world that they're environmentally sustainable. They have a bird collision deterrence credit, and they have given guidelines in that of what to follow. And then also organizations have sustainability standards. So for example, we've worked with the University of Chicago on their couple projects. The latest one is the Student Health and Wellness Center. So University of Chicago has a bird safety checklist. Additionally, my company, White & Company, has an internal sustainability standard that we follow where we state we should be exploring having bird deterrence on our buildings too. So there's a lot of resources out there. They're all slightly different, but there is a lot of overlap. So to give you an idea of what that is, here's just like a clip from one. You don't need to read all this. I know the text is really small, but generally what they do is they outline a bunch of different requirements. This is a really nice diagram on the left-hand side of what parts of the building are the most threatening to birds, and it highlights what you should do for each of those areas. And then they ask you to comply by creating diagrams and stating what products you're going to be using on your project. And here's a little chart, for example, of how you might state how you're meeting the requirements. So making the actual drawings to show you're meeting the requirements is one thing, but really what this takes is a lot of research on looking at products, trying to figure out how to integrate them into the project, making sure the technical parameters work well, cross-referencing the costs, comparing those, passing it by ownership to make sure it's the right solution for the project. So just like any element of a building, there's a bit of research, a bit of design, and then a bit of cost estimating and making sure it works within the context of the project. This happens to be a clip from the New York code, but they're pretty similar for all of the different bullet points I showed you on the last slide. There's a lot of overlap in those. So that's just an example of what we're looking at when we're looking at those standards. So when it comes to what the intent of those standards is, as architects, we're really looking to correct for two problems with glazing in particular: transparency and reflection. So the thing that all these buildings at the, photographed here from Chicago have in common is they are known bird killers. So there are other measures we're looking to in architecture, such as, for example, keeping the lights off at night, maybe not putting greenery inside of a glass wall so that birds tend to fly at it. A lot of those tend to be a little bit more operational. But this is the meat and potatoes problem here, is the transparency and the reflection. So this is the one that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today. Just to give you a sense of what that means, for example, on the left, this has reflection, obviously. I want to note that the glass on the building on the left here is not very reflective. It's glass, though. Glass is inherently reflective. So even if an architect is not selecting a very mirrored look glass, it's still going to be highly reflective, especially at the lower elevations of projects. A lot of our building stock in the US is at those lower elevations. I know Chicago's a little bit of an anomaly, but a lot of the codes actually state that under 75 feet or under 40 feet is really where we want to make sure we're paying a lot of attention to on our buildings. And then on the right-hand side, you're seeing that effect of a very clear glass, the transparency, and having some greenery inside of it that, birds might want to go to. So when we're looking at products out there, we're looking at a couple of rules of thumb. And it's really understanding sort of bird behavior and anatomy. So we call this the 2x4 rule. So if we're creating patterns on the face of a building called the facade, exterior skin of it, we want to really make sure we're designing a pattern or an intervention that's less than 2 inches in the horizontal direction and 4 inches in the vertical to sort of deter birds from hitting that element. The other thing we're looking at is the fact that birds see at different spectrums than we do. So we could potentially take advantage of the different wavelengths that they see at as our interventions to create things that they see and not us. And I'll dive into those here more deeply. So I want to cover what those products and strategies are that we start to look at as we're designing a building. So the first thing we can do seems like super obvious, but optimizing the amount of glass. So just not having as much glass. So as architects, we're really looking to get enough daylight into the building to make sure that the people are in a very healthy environment. And what we're trying to do is make sure that at least 50% of the time, there's enough daylight coming into a building that the lights don't need to be on. We consider this a very healthy amount of light. We also want to balance it by having less than 10% of the time having glare in a space. So after we design buildings, we run simulations. The graphic in this slide is actually a floor plan of a building that we run through a computer simulation to understand what we've selected in regards to the amount of windows and how much daylight it lets in. And after we do all this, really what we want to do is also then cross-reference it against our energy performance of the building. So we'll have an engineer run our energy performance model to make sure that with the correct amount of windows for daylight, that we have not too many windows to have a poor energy performance on the building. And really where I find in my practice, we end up being is having about 30 to 50% of the exterior wall of buildings be windows. So obviously you've all seen buildings out there where it feels like it's 100% of the building is windows, but really as architects, we want to make sure that's good and lower. And this helps the birds, it helps the energy performance, and it's great, still great for humans on the inside. So when we do have glass, there's a couple things we can do to treat it to make it more friendly towards birds. The first and best treatment is to place something on the exterior surface of the glass, so the part of the glass that face outside. So by putting something on the outside face of the glass, we're affecting both transparency and reflection. So here is where we can decrease our threat to birds the most while still having the greatest visibility for humans outside and the greatest amount of daylight coming in. There's kind of two common ways to do that. One is to put a film on the outside of the glass. This is really great for projects that are already built. This runs about $15 to $25 a square foot. Just a side note, all the costs I'm going to give you are estimated from this fall, and they are going to vary and generally increase over time. So a temporary film actually is warranted to last only about 10 years. So it's a good retrofit solution. The other thing you could do is actually, when the glass is being fabricated, bake into the glass a ceramic frit or etch into it with an acid etch pattern. This would cost about $35 to $55 a square foot. And so an example of that second one is here on the side, you can kind of see this pattern of dots on the glass. They meet that 2x4 inch rule that I talked about earlier to help keep the birds safe. The second thing we can do is look at an interior surface of the glass. So this is actually less effective because you're not affecting your reflection, you're reflecting mostly transparency. So in order to make it a little bit more protective, generally what we have to do is increase the density of this. So they would do a similar thing where they would bake a ceramic frit on the glass, and it would be a permanent solution, and it would save a lot of money. It would only cost $10 to $20 a square foot. This is a little bit less desirable if you're going to have it be as effective because it is that dense pattern you're getting. And a lot of people don't like that from, a visibility standpoint. A private developer might say, hey, that's not exactly saleable to people. They might not want to look through that. But this is one where sometimes we do this on projects to say, for example, control for sun. Maybe it's not the whole piece of glass, but it's a part of it. And it might be one where some intervention is better than no intervention. So this is kind of your compromise solution. And then the third thing you can do is look at a UV pattern glass. So this is glass that essentially it works when it works. It works when you have brighter lighting conditions to highlight that UV pattern on the glass. And this is a spider web pattern here that's pretty effective. It's less effective, obviously, in the evening, at night, or if you have lower light level conditions. So this has a variable amount of threat protection to it. I would also like to note it's very expensive. I've never actually gotten too far in looking into this for a project just due to the cost of it. Another thing you could do is to physically deter. So put a screen, a grill, a panel in front of the glass. So this is a photo of this here on a building. It's an architectural strategy. It could be used to shade the glass from the sun. It could be potentially very expensive, but it's a nice solution that works in some different areas. The fourth thing you can do is if you have glass needs for daylight, you could look at alternates to having it be clear. So you could look at a translucent glass or a polycarbonate panel. So this is an example of it in the photo. Has to be the right solution. You have to essentially not have views outward. This is a museum, a perfect example of when you'd want to use it. So this is actually fairly cost neutral, and it could only cost a small amount depending on what you do. So it's a pretty effective solution that we actually find ourselves using where we can. Another one I'd like to mention is skylights. Skylights are a really great way to get daylight deep into a building that's not threatening to birds. So instead of increasing the amount of windows on the perimeter of your building, you could drop a few skylights in and get daylight deep into the space. Two challenges is one is it's very expensive, and building owners like to joke if you install a skylight, you install a leak. So these need to be kind of judiciously placed, but they're a good strategy to consider too. So with that, I want to do a little bit of math, not too much, but just a little bit to kind of see how these ideas might shake out in projects. So our first example here is a medium-sized public project. It was designed well so that only 25% of the facade is glass. So overall, we have about 5,000 square feet of glass on this project. 100% of it is covered for bird-friendly glass, just because the client had said that's what we want. So if we look at the different options I just talked through, you can see the variety of cost measures that it would be, ranging from 75,000 square foot for installing an exterior film, all the way up to 375,000 for an architectural perforated panel. So that gives you a sense of what they cost. On this project, the construction cost was about $21 million. So it's a pretty small percentage of the overall construction cost, although it still is a pretty large portion of money, especially for a public project when funds are limited. They want to make sure that the best use of taxpayer dollar is, going towards the greatest good. So in this instance, this is the project I'll actually talk about in greater detail later. This is in a forest preserve. So it was decided to go ahead with this. We did some of these kind of cost estimating really early on the project to determine what the cost would be. We chose to do the exterior surface ceramic frit in combination with the architectural perforated panel in a few areas. And we baked that into the project from the very onset so that it could not be kind of taken away. And it was basically the condition of satisfaction for the owner. And I want to compare this against a larger size private project. So this is it's not a real project, but it's a hypothetical project on the East Coast. So in this one, the developer wants a lot of glass because that's what's going to get him high rents. So we have about half of the facade being glass on this project, 53,000 square feet. If you look at what the bird-friendly glass is, basically anything below 75 feet, which would be a code minimum on the East Coast, that's only 15,000 square feet of glass. And that's considering the architect did her job and she made sure that the bottom of the building was much more solid in appearance, just to blend into the streetscape. So with a $150 million project here, we wouldn't recommend a lot of solutions due to the fact that this is a high rise. We wouldn't recommend a temporary film. We wouldn't really recommend an interior ceramic frit because it would be too dense to matter. And then people who live there wouldn't like looking out of it. And we think that an architectural perforated panel is very interesting, but it might cause a maintenance issue with the owner. So essentially we'd be looking at spending about $500,000 on a ceramic frit on this project, just to cover that lower portion of the project and those kind of high impact zones that are identified in code. So it's a small percentage of the overall construction budget again, but the way a developer might work, they would start to ask questions such as, oh, do I need to lose a floor of my units? Oh my gosh, that would lose me $250,000 in rent a year. Or I can keep the same number of units and I can increase the rent to everybody on these. So those are just some of the kind of conversations and thoughts that would go through in a project like this, and just to kind of see as a lump sum that $500,000 impact potentially, depending on how you design the bird intervention. So all in all, it's a conversation that's been being had. I'm finding that in the last, as I mentioned, 10 years, the demand has been increasing. And this is a good thing because as we change the landscape and increase demand, the number of available products come to market. Even in the last 3 years, I think I've seen so many new products come to light that we can specify. And this is good because it actually creates competition and the unit costs decrease over time as contractors become more used to installing them and people kind of looking through them and understanding what they are, the costs even out. Other things that are changing is just developing and supporting bird-friendly design ordinances. So a lot of these are being developed. You can see in that yield database, there's more and more every year. Starting small, working out unintended consequences, and then growing the policy over time seems to be what a lot of different regions are doing. Another thing is obviously participating in stakeholder engagement sessions. The more we hear from people, the more owners hear directly from people, the better chance of at least having small impacts to potentially large impacts like the project I'm going to show you here in a second will have. And then, of course, reaching out to those large landholders, large building stockholders, different design groups, policymakers, and making sure that sustainable policies and standards are integrated into businesses for designers, for people who own buildings and operate buildings. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this works in the real world in a project through the case study of Willowbrook Wildlife Center. So I know some of you may be familiar with Willowbrook, maybe some aren't, so I'll cover that briefly. So Willowbrook Wildlife Center is a newly designed net zero native wildlife rehabilitation center. So what that means is it's a campus that provides care and medical treatment to injured and orphaned wild animals. It also serves as a resource to help teach residents and visitors about living in harmony with local wildlife. So the mission of the building is to literally help animals who've been injured by humans, intentionally or unintentionally. A lot of bird collision victims actually come to Willowbrook Wildlife Center, even from Cook County, from all over the area. They're brought to this facility where the staff intakes them. They go through a triage process. They will be examined. They go through surgery if needed. Then they might go through an ICU. It's kind of like people almost. They have an indoor rehabilitation process until they're strong enough to be in outdoor enclosures while they become accustomed to the weather. And then their goal is to release them into the wild. So that's what Willowbrook does. This campus is located in Glen Ellen. It's located on Park Boulevard, really close to the College of DuPage campus. It's in a forest preserve. This diagram is a bird's eye view. It shows in the darker gray colors that there's a couple of existing buildings that are going to remain on site. But really what we're doing is creating a whole campus of different structures to help that rehabilitation process. We have a main clinic and visitor center, that's the punctuation mark at the right-hand side of the screen, and a collection of smaller structures, which are different rehabilitation enclosures that are tailor-made for different species. So we have a flight barn for raptors. We have a carnivore enclosure, small carnivores, small mammals. We have waterfowl, songbirds, turtles, and a collection of other different typologies also all on this campus. It's a really unique type of place. So all of the animals come in through the main clinic and visitor center for that assessment I talked about. And then as they go through the rehabilitation process, they make their way to these outdoor enclosures, and then they're released within forest preserve property within DuPage County. So as we did our stakeholder engagement for this process, the Forest Preserve asked us to be as sustainable as possible. We're like, could you be a little more specific? So we went through a lot of different engagement sessions with them, and this is a handful of things they came up with that they wanted included in the project. So basically trying to hit at all levels of sustainability, things that we could integrate into the project, including bird-friendly glass. But one thing I want to highlight for just a second is the fact that they wanted to be a net zero energy use project. So what that means is that the energy generated on site is equal to or greater than the energy consumed within an annual basis. So in this photo here, this is a net zero project that's already completed, and you can see the sea of PV panels on the roof to harvest the sun. So this is really important to this conversation, because the number one thing that you can do to help ecosystems is to be net zero, because by reducing our impact on global warming, we're helping not just the immediate context of a bird, striking a building, but we're helping the habitat of all the wild animals throughout the country and throughout the world, frankly. So we want to make sure we're thinking at a macro and a micro scale when we're designing buildings to help the ecology of the place. So in Illinois, this is the number of net zero projects that there are. It's not that many. It's been very hard to get to this point in time, but I am thrilled to state that there's another 10 that are in the process of becoming net zero certified. So what you have to do for this is essentially you have to operate your building for 1 year and prove that you're harvesting more energy than you're using. I just want to note the ones highlighted in red are 3 that my company has actually completed. So we're known for our sustainable practices, including our ability to deliver net zero projects. So hopefully in another couple of years, Willowbrook will be able to join this list here. So Willowbrook itself is a 2-story building located in the Forest Preserve. This is a view of the main clinic. The lower volume in front is the visitor center. So you enter in one side, you go through an exhibit hall space, and then you can exit at the other, and then you can take a hike in the Forest Preserve. Sort of steps back where that 2nd-story volume is actually the staff offices, kind of receding from view there. To kind of turn our heads around here, this is a view of the wildlife hospital entry. You can see on the left-hand side. So rehabilitators who are bringing animals to this facility will enter in a separate entry from where the public might be entering to go to the visitor center, just to kind of keep those separately. It's a very stressful time for both the animals and people bringing animals in. So they have a separate entry where they can drop off, and then they can actually go to the visitor center and wait and track for to see how the animal's progress is doing. One thing I want to note, I mentioned earlier, this building has 25% of the building envelope is glass. We did a lot of really detailed modeling to make sure we were getting good levels of daylight into the space, especially where the people and animals are being held. The middle of the building is the surgery, so we don't want daylight in the surgery. We want that to be highly controlled. And another thing I'd like to note is we actually have operable windows in this building to make sure that the animals get fresh air in all the places that they are too, not just the people who work there. Here's a really great view of the classroom. So there is an educational space too, where groups of kids or adults can come to learn a little bit more. Two things highlighted here you'll note are the bird deterrent measures. So one thing is the perforated metal screen panel that you see kind of on the left-hand side, that lacy filigree pattern in front of the glass. And the other is actually an etched pattern in the surface of the glass that has these large leaves. What you don't see is the teeny tiny dots between them because it's just a little bit small in scale. But both of these are highlighted in the classroom so that they can talk about these two different measures to people when they're within the facility. To dive into those a little bit more, so we've developed both of those patterns based on native Illinois leaves, just as an educational tool about our native landscape. So we took inspiration on the physical screen deterrents from the skeletons of leaves in the veining structure. So all of this passes by that 2-inch by 4-inch rule that I talked about earlier, and these screens are hung in front of the glass to just basically physically stop from animals colliding into the glass. They leave a little bit of space for maintenance and washing the windows, but that's about it. As we developed the patterns for the glass, we gave the client a lot of different options. We're actually still designing this, but we looked at native grasses, leaves, etc. And you can see we have a larger super scale graphic on the glass, and in the void spaces, we have a grid of dots just to prevent any sort of fly-through activity there. So really good kind of fun things we're doing just to catch people's eye and draw their attention to this challenge, not just make it recede from vision. So we saw this as a teaching opportunity. Another thing is on the interior of the building. We've been working with an exhibit designer to really tailor the exhibits to helping people really just, again, build a relationship with nature and, take up the arms of what they want to do. So we do have a bird migration panel on the inside where they will be talking a lot about the migratory paths, different wingspans, different species types, et cetera, who pass through the area. We have a habitat wall where we'll be talking a lot about the habitats of different animals, including birds. The entire outside of the building was designed by the landscape architect to include a wildlife garden. So it provides basic food, shelter, protection for animals, and water also. So we're using the outside as a teaching element and then referencing some of the specifics here on the inside and that visitor experience. Also, when you're in the visitor center, we have large windows where you can actually look into the examination room and surgery if you have the stomach for it, where you can watch a turtle get an x-ray or you can watch a hawk's wing get mended. The glass is one way, so the animals can't see you, but you can see the animals because we want to make sure their stress levels are as low as possible. And so we have a lot of really great panels and educational tools to help people understand the process of rehabilitating animals, not just what we do intentionally or unintentionally to cause harm. A couple other views here. This is a view of the check-in and triage area. This is a huge difference from what they have today. Today, if you've ever been there, it's extremely cramped. We want to make sure as animals are brought into the facility that it's a lower stress environment. There's plenty of space. We can separate species. We don't want our little coyote pups next to owlets, for example. So the staff has a really nice, professional, welcoming place to intake the animals into the center. One thing I want to mention too is in the people areas of the project, we are looking at a wood structure in combination with steel. And this is really important because, it's beautiful. It fits into a nature preserve, but wood is actually what we call a low embodied carbon material. So basically what that means is the energy that's used to extract, fabricate, ship to the site, install wood is actually much less than steel or concrete. So wherever it's possible or I'd say efficient, we're looking at using a wood structure. This is important because, unfortunately, in regards to global carbon emissions, buildings produce 37% of global carbon emissions. So that's like a lot. You can drive a hybrid all you want, but we have to address this challenge. And this has to do not just with operational carbon, so amount of energy you use in the year. We talked about net zero earlier and how important that was, but a lot of it's the fabricating of elements that go into a building. So the amount of energy it takes to build a building is equal to 30 years of operating a building, which is kind of a staggering number. So the energy use it takes for 30 years of Willowbrook is equal to what it takes to build the building. So whenever possible, we really want to look at the materials we're putting in our building and look at the life cycle carbon emissions for those, from extracting them to transporting them, manufacturing them, getting them on site, using them to be built. And even if they need to go back to the earth or be recycled afterwards, we want to track those and pick smart materials for projects that really have our lower embodied carbon emissions. So that's why at Willowbrook, in a lot of our areas, it's the wood structure, which is a huge impact, but also other materials within the facility. We're looking at using natural local things that have, we're not shipping from Germany elements, right? We're not going across the sea, because that ties into that story I told earlier about global warming and not having a huge impact on ecosystems throughout the world. So where we are today. The first phase has been completed, which includes a lot of animal rehabilitation enclosures. I have 2 photos here I took about 2 weeks ago. On the left-hand side is the raptor barn. If you have sharp eyes, you can probably see 6 birds of prey in that space. This is a really great space where they can fly free. They can bank left and right, so they can be assessed by veterinarians to determine if they're healthy enough for release. And you can kind of see them all aggregating there. The one on the right-hand side is our bobcat kitty. So he's up there in his little nook. He's having a good time in his new enclosure that's a lot bigger, and it's much less stressful for him to hang out at. So that has been completed. And then currently they're building the new clinic and visitor center. So these are photos from the last week here. So you can see them in the bigger photo. They have a crane out and they're placing the wood timber structure, view of it on the inside there in the upper corner. So making great progress. If you're ever driving down Park Boulevard in Glen Ellen, you can pull into the parking lot and check it out and see what they're doing. We're expecting to open here at the very end of the year. The hot time at Willowbrook is essentially spring through fall, when they start getting their babies in the spring, all the way through the fall migration season. So they're really hoping to be up and rocking and ready for next spring to welcome the newest batch. It's currently closed to the public. You can't go in and look at exhibits or anything in the old clinic and visitor center because we have the site kind of shut down for construction. But looking forward to this opening actually at the end of this year. So with that, I think I've talked plenty. Perfect, right on time. I saved a few minutes for questions. So feel free, Christina.
All right, thank you so much, Danielle. That was so informative, and the new Willowbrook building is just absolutely beautiful. So that's very exciting. If anyone has any questions, you can put those into the chat. But I'll start us off. I have a technical question for you. You mentioned threat factor a few times. Could you talk about like what that number means?
Yeah, great. No, awesome question. So threat factor. Threat factor is from 1 to 100. 1 meaning it pretty much has birds will not impact with it. Birds will deter 100% from it. 100 means basically 100% of the time birds are going to try and hit it. And the way they assess it is they have a tunnel test. So essentially they build a tunnel and they safely fly birds down it. They prevent them from actually striking. And they count and assess how many times the bird will go towards the material and collide with it, or almost collide with it. So all the products on market today, many of them have been tested in the tunnel tests, and they're given a threat factor based on how well they perform. So a lot of the different guides that I talked about earlier state what you need to have as a threat factor. Seems to be like 30 or better is where we want to be. Most products that you see out there on the market are in the like maybe 15 to 20 range. That seems to be what's really palatable to people. And in regards to sort of cost and having intervention on the glass. So something like a brick wall might be a threat factor of 1, for example. You might have, for example, a really shiny metal that actually might be somewhat threatening to birds. So we obviously don't want buildings that are made of extremely shiny metal anyways. It can kind of be harmful to humans too to look at that. But all different building materials are tested there. And really what we look at for most of those threat factors is the ones that are kind of laminated onto the glass and how they perform.
Okay, great, thank you. And then you mentioned that to me, actually, not in this presentation, that you had written kind of a policy for your company when you go meet with a client for a brand new project, that your staff, your team, everyone that works for you, you have to discuss bird-friendly design with your client. Can you tell me, like, what's maybe their typical reaction, or were there clients you thought would definitely say no that said yes, or you thought that they'd say yes and they said no?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have our own white sustainability standard. So it's pages and pages of information, and essentially it says we should be considering bird-friendly strategy. And I'm on the team who helped write the policy. They have members from different groups within our office. Our office includes engineers and construction too. So we have representatives from all of our disciplines. Just a little background on that. So we essentially have a lot of templates in-house. So when we run these visioning sessions, we bring it up. Something like a forest preserve district or a public building, we tend to try and sell it a little bit harder, just because we know there's a lot of public interest out of there. Someone like Willowbrook, they surprised us where they were like, this is a must. We can't not have it. Where we have had other forest preserves who are like, yeah, that's a we'd like to have it. Let's just see how much it costs. Like that's one we get a lot is all of these ideas are great. Let's see how much they cost. That seems to be an answer to a lot of the things we put out there. There are other projects where maybe it doesn't take foot so much, but we kind of sneak it in a little bit. So, for example, I have a project under design right now that's a wellness center for people. And so we are putting some acid etch on the glass to actually provide privacy to patients in the building, where it actually does double duty. It does that, but it does provide some threat protection to birds. Not like Willowbrook, not to this level. It's not 100%, but my opinion is like 70% is better than 0%. So if we can put it in as another design element, we might just slip it in anyways. That's especially useful for anything in architecture. If we can find double duty for something, that's where it can gain traction and get involved in the project. But there are other clients. I think there's one I'm thinking of in particular where we had bird-friendly strategy in through the middle phase of design, and it just cost too much. And they're like, we're not paying that amount of money. Some people were nicer about it. Some were like, oh man, that's a bummer. Others were like, expletive, no, too much money. So everyone has a different opinion on it, but we try.
All right, I like that, sneaking it in. That's great. We have a question about Willowbrook. Are there room darkening shades for the classroom if there are like slide presentations or videos?
Yes, absolutely. So all of the areas for the offices, for the classroom, not for the main lobby, like the entry point where you enter, which you actually see on the screen here. I'm not sure if you see my mouse, like not there, but all the other windows have those room darkening blinds, yes.
Okay, great. And then Paula says that she's seen illustrations of high-rise buildings with a lot of vegetation on the outside of the building. Is that safe for birds?
There needs to be special requirement for that. In many of the standards, it will ask you to pay attention to those areas. And if you're within a certain distance of that, they ask you to consider protection there too, because you could also, again, just like at grade, have reflections into the glass or just a greater density of animals there. So yes, that is one of the kind of areas that could threaten the animals there.
Okay, and then next question is about light pollution. How do you address that in your design?
No, that's a really great question. So for the outside of buildings, our sustainability standard says we have no upward facing or outward facing light. We limit our light pollution on site. This is actually a dark sky project that we're looking at here, where we don't have any exterior lighting beyond code required. Now on the inside of the building, this is where it becomes operational. So Willowbrook actually committed to turning their lights off in the facility. I forget what time of night. They have animals there 24/7, but they actually do turn off the lights even for people coming to the site in the evening. So unlike the rendering behind me where we turn the lights on so you could see it, that's actually not going to happen. So this is kind of a building owner question. A lot of our clients don't operate evening hours, so that's a good thing because then they're turning the lights off. And we do have the conversation with them from an energy standpoint, and then also from a bird standpoint that they should be powering down when people aren't, at the facility or using it. Also, by code, a lot of lights are required to be on occupancy sensors and daylight sensors too. So like if nobody's in the building, the lights shouldn't be on. And that's part of the energy codes that have been coming out in recent years. I hope that answered that.
Okay, great. Next question. Could you comment on the expected lifespan of the new flight rehab center that has a lot of slotted wood?
Yeah, great question. Let me go back to that slide really quick. Actually, yes. So this is treated wood. It should last a while. They have a flight barn on site now. They have like a donut shaped one that they built in 2005. It's doing very well. What we did with this one is we made sure it's treated wood. The steel will be there forever, but the way it's designed to easily be able to, pull off a slat if it's going poor. But we wanted to make sure the structure on this was actually steel. So a lot of these rehabilitation enclosures you might see if you've ever toured one of these is they're all made of wood, including the structure. And that's where the problem starts to end up being after some time. It's having that exposed to the weather. So for a structure like this, it was a requirement that everything is open air and even that the roof has slats because they want the animals to be able to feel the rain. So we just had to make sure that the wood was replaceable because we do know, and they do know that over time it would degrade. That being said, there's really strict standards for all of the animal enclosures from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Association and what types of materials you can use. It needs to be friendly to that type of animal. Birds, for example, they really talk about, making sure the feathers don't get clipped by the different materials in there. It needs to be smooth, for example. So wood is a really popular option that's approved. There are more permanent and basically non-destructible options that would have been significantly more money, like, 4 or 5 times as much. So that was basically just something that was accepted by ownership on this barn.
Great, thank you. Next question. In your experience, which authority having jurisdiction or industry guide has the most rigorous requirements in bird-friendly building design?
Ooh, I don't know about rigorous. Especially because I haven't obviously used most authorities having jurisdiction. I couldn't speak to that. I would say the one that I see referenced the most and seems to kind of hit on a lot of the topics is the American Bird Conservancy. Is that how I had it written down here earlier? I'll go back to it. That one seems to kind of have the ideas throughout most of the ones that I've seen and come across. And they actually are the ones that have the list of all the products and the threat factors. So I find it to be like a really good, I don't know, guide to look through. Yeah, American Bird Conservancy. So this is the one that I use a lot. I've actually, I haven't actually done a building in New York since this has been done, so I can't speak to that. I read through it just to kind of create this example, and it seemed to be pretty similar and kind of hit all the key points.
Okay, great. There's a question about clients and if they're open to the additional costs, if they can offset it with energy savings.
It's funny, I've tried to run that calculation. It actually doesn't save a ton. If you're doing something like a screen, then maybe yes, absolutely. Let me actually go the wrong way. So those like architectural screens I showed you, those have a pretty good impact, things like this on the energy savings. When you're putting the treatments on the glass, especially this one where it's a little bit more lacy, it really doesn't move the needle. I'm sorry to say, I thought the exact same thing, and I had our energy modeler in-house run the calculation. He's like, I'm sorry, it didn't work. If you're doing something like this on the number 2 or on the inside surface, this can actually have an effect, absolutely. It's just not as good for the birds as the other one. That's a harder case to make. That being said, actually, one thing I didn't mention is good old-fashioned window screens. Like if you have a residential home or even like a multifamily high-rise, window screens are super cost effective to install, and they actually will deter strikes.
Great. Okay, well, a question about your Willowbrook project. Is the building set up for future solar panel installation?
So pretty much, I didn't go into deep here. Let me get back to a drawing. Everything has solar panels on it that can. So one of the challenges with Willowbrook was getting net zero while being located in a dense wooded area, unlike that high school I showed you earlier that had just like a lot of great sun exposure. So all of our roofs have solar. So on the visitor and clinic, all three of our main roof lines have solar on it. The existing species propagation building here already has a solar array on it. The newly existing Raptor barn up here, this is our other large structure. It's designed to face south and it has a huge solar array on it. And actually, we convinced the Forest Preserve to remove these trees here and do a huge ground mount solar array. So we're really taking advantage of all the solar orientation that we can to put solar panels on things. And it was hard on the Raptor barn because we needed to space them out to allow that rain and wind to get down to the animals too. I would say the last available area is the parking lot, which most people say, oh, why didn't you just put it all in the parking lot? Because the parking lot's new and we would have had to rip it up and install massive foundations to hold the solar canopy above the cars, which you can do. It just was extremely cost prohibitive. So we felt like designing our structures as many as we could to hold solar panels on them was more of a cost effective reason. But it's not to say in 20 years, 30 years, they couldn't take out the parking lot and do that. It's a beautiful permeable paver parking lot that allows for stormwater penetration. It's a very nice parking lot.
Okay, great. And then we had a comment that the Canadian standards are pretty fantastic, but also LEED finally updated their spacing to a 2x2 grid last fall.
Oh, that's good information. And I should note, I know 2x4 is the rule of thumb. Sounds like 2x2 is more popular. We have noticed that the 2x2s seem to do better with the threat factors. And I will say that we've actually designed our glass for the 2x2 at Willowbrook here. That's just like a point of reference.
Okay, great. All right, I think I got all of the questions that were asked. Okay, great. And I've really enjoyed, I think it's the DuPage County Forest Preserve on Instagram. They have little interviews with White Construction about the progress of construction. I've been enjoying those little videos over the last year. So if you haven't seen those, you should check them out. All right, I think we'll wrap up for tonight. Thank you so much, Danielle, for joining us for this amazing discussion. I think we all learned quite a bit from this. And then just a final note, just check out our website if you want to learn more about our programs, both online and in person, including the Peregrine programs, field trips, photography workshops, and more. So thank you everyone again for joining us for Birds and Bytes, and have a good evening.